My name is Valerie Hunt. I started as a small child as a mystic from several experiences in which my life was threatened. And I went into a cosmic state, or as we could call it, an autistic state, and I stayed there for about 5 months. And in that 5 months, I had experiences with God, and that was all I remembered. And finally, I came out of that experience, and God told me I would come down and bring to the world beauty. And I said to God, I'm a 3-year-old, I don't know what beauty is. And he said, I'll give you all the skills. So I came back into normal consciousness with the skills of an artist. I composed music, I painted, I wrote poetry, I read textbooks, and I had never before learned to read. Could I comprehend them? Well, not too well. And so I moved on in that domain as a mystic. I was a very normal little child before age 3. My parents were educated people, college degrees at that time was most unusual. And so I grew up as an intellectual.
What part of the United States is this?
Midwest, Indiana. And I grew up kind of angry at God because he gave me all the skills and I couldn't use them. Until one day I had contact with God who said, I want you to bring wisdom. And so this was a way out. And so I became an intellectual and went on into studying of science in universities. And I was a hardcore scientist, always with a flair for the creative and the imaginative, because that was a basic part of me. And I started out as a neurological physiologist, and I taught at the University of Iowa, Columbia University, and UCLA, where I taught for 40 years and ended up full professor.
What impact did your work and your discoveries have on your life?
Well, this was called total revolution, not evolution, but revolution. Although I was always a curious researcher, I stuck to the hardcore explanation and the design. And the day that a mystic came in to me and said, I go into a trance, will you record it? And I said, I don't know what a trance is. I don't know how to record a trance. I went home, went to sleep, and the next day I knew how to record a trance. So I recorded the first trance dancing that was ever recorded. And what I found out when I recorded it, there was a period of time in which all of the neurological information, including the brainwave, that we commonly thought was a person alive, and these dropped down to practically nothing, got altered, which would mean the person is not alive. They were sitting up. You can't do that and sit up. You have to have muscle. And they went pouring out the crown with a frequency that was so high it almost tore up my instruments. And I was then working with telemetry, which was I had the first telemetry set that was ever used in biology after the astronauts had their telemetry sets recording their heart rate, blood pressure, and galvanic skin response from a distance. And so that was my revolutionary evolution.
For you, what is consciousness? What is human consciousness?
You asked me for a big title, and I will tell you. I think it is a kind of awareness that has to do with the vibratory field of the world, which is everything. And it can have various levels of awareness. There is a level which is very basic, which most people don't have. They're not aware of what we call the sublingual, the subliminal vibrations of the earth, and they're not aware of these in their own body. And if we're aware of that, that is a level of consciousness. Some of the lower phylogenetic groups of animals have this as their primary level. But we lose it because it's not high enough for us.
Is that in any way related to the Schumann wave in 7.82 cycles a second?
The Schumann wave is a vibratory thing that's coming from the earth, as near as we can tell. But the Schumann wave is always there. The awareness of us is not. So it has to do with the very low frequencies, and they are magnetic. That is correct. And Schumann is a magnetic resonance. Mm-hmm. And then we go into a next level of vibrations, which have to do with the human brain and the human tissue. And that is, tissue vibrates. We have a DNA that instructs the tissue and it vibrates because life is a vibratory thing. And this is controlled on the basic level by the nature of atoms and then by the nature of the instruction that these atoms get. And then the nature of tissue, which has an instructional level, the nature of organs, which has an organ level, and the nature of the brain, which has an overall level. That's only part of it. Mm-hmm. And then there is the highest level, which is the level of the mind. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of the first ones that ever said, the mind is not in the brain. I found it in the vibratory field, in the very, very high frequencies. As soon as we did the EEG, and the EEG went into alpha and theta, the brainwave, or the mind, went crazy. It just got more and more elaborate, more and more exciting, higher and higher frequencies. So we have all three of those. Now, what is consciousness? It is an awareness of the entire universe and our experiences with it on every level, and being able to shift one to the other based upon our need or our desire. And most people are locked into various levels of their consciousness. And as I record their vibratory field, I can tell you where they're going to process most information. Some of our athletic jocks are going to process it on the lower level, but that doesn't mean the great athletes. And then the intellectuals, the university professors are some of the worst. They do it all on the intellectual level, and that's as far as they're going to get. If they can't make sense of this material matter, it doesn't exist. And then some of our conscious people are processing it all up there, and they can't make a living. They can't live, and their bodies are a mess.
Okay, so now how do emotions figure in all of this? What role do emotions play in the experience of consciousness?
Emotions are an organized energy. That's what emotions are. It's organized energy, which has information, which tends to direct the body and its functions. Now, there are emotions that we commonly think of that are in psychiatry and psychology, which have to do with emotions connected to material substances. And this is my ego, my possessions, the people, my sex, my relationships in the world, and my belief systems. And these, of course, are stored in the brain. And we don't come in with them, we develop them as the result of our experience. Now, that is emotion, but it is the lower level of emotion, and it's the kind that we generally call emotion. The emotion which is connected to the organized energy, which is connected to the protection and the elaboration of the soul, is the biggie. And when we get into that level of emotion, we have emotion. And it is 5-10 times more elaborate, stronger. And I work with this. I work with opening the emotions of people. And when we get there, we find the sources of our problems. Most of the sources of major problems are only secondary sources in the brain. The primary sources in the field and in the mind.
Have you found that discordant emotions produced a lowering of vibratory, having a lowering vibratory effect, and while harmonizing emotions have did the opposite?
I would put it a little different way. Okay. I would call it coherency and anti-coherency. We can have coherency in a relatively low vibratory field. We can have coherency in a mid-level field. We can have coherence in a high field. We can have anti-coherency in any of them. Now, it doesn't have so much to do, it has to do with the flow and whether things are in sync in the entire body. That has to do with pleasant and happy emotions as contrasted to those that are sadder and more upsetting. There is a small element there of level of the vibration, but it's not predominant. The predominant one is the pattern of it. The pattern of it. And when we're extremely happy and it's extremely coherent, we will go into the higher states. But when it's extremely smooth and extremely flowing in the lower vibrations, we will go in other vibrations. Do you follow?
You elaborate on that.
Yes. When it becomes coherent, it starts flowing the whole way. And if the coherency starts on the lower level, it will flow to the next higher level. And if it's coherent on that level, it'll flow. So you have the total flow. And this, of course, is conscious awareness.
Oh, I see. So in that sense, it's kind of shooting through the spectrum of conscious awareness.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And when so many people and so many books, Paul, talk about going up in consciousness, it's called spreading your consciousness is what you want. To go up in consciousness can leave you in a mess because you cannot handle the material things of the world. Your body gets very sick when you go extremely high vibrations.
So you could have an incoherency building at a lower, so-called lower vibratory level.
You could, and what you do is you have an absence of vibrations. And when you get an absence of the lower vibrations, you don't have physiological health because vitality has to do with those low vibrations. Physiological vitality. Now, intellectual vitality, that's something different. And emotional and spiritual vitality, that's something different. When you're talking about the temple and its life, physiology, you have to have the low ones.
Observations, I'm reading some observations you had about coma states. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on what how you would characterize coma states now, given what you've observed in your research.
Yes, I know about coma states. I've been in comas. And a coma is a state in which we are not connected to the ordinary reality of the world. We're just not connected there. And we don't want to be. Now, when we bring people out of comas, we go work on the will. We don't work on the vibration, they'll throw it right off. We just work on the will. And we work on the will, we can start lowering the vibrations. And when we lower the vibrations, we bring them into what we call reality, which is the ordinary common sense of the material world.
So I remember reading that coma states had characterization of very low voltage, microvoltage levels, lower than some other states, and in such a way that that these levels of energy would not normally be associated with any kind of higher function.
This is what makes the, in a coma state, which makes the body so inert, so terribly inert, but alive. Unless there were these very low vibrations, the body would not live. It would die. So it is, we find the extremely high vibrations and some of the very, very low vibrations, but none of the in-between, which is what we call reality and like a coma.
Right. So there's a kind of a paradox there, though, wouldn't you say? Like a bookended version of reality. It's obviously a real state.
It's a real state, and it's a state that we can bring people out of. We can bring them out of it. It's not difficult. If you are able to manipulate with your mind and go in and work with the person on the mind level, you can bring them out of a coma.
Well, that's now, let's follow that for a second. How do you go about working with a person on the mind level in order to achieve that?
I'll tell you what the process is. You know, it's very simple. If you know you can do it, you can do it.
That's it.
That's it. No, that's not totally it. So what you do is you think. And thought is a vibration. And you think and you ask that mind questions. Now that mind is not dead. It's not able to speak.
Now we're talking about the mind of the comatose person at this moment, right?
Comatose person or anybody that's on drug or anything else. So you ask that mind what seems to be the problem. Now if you listen, that mind will tell you what the problem is.
Now, obviously this is not at the auditory level, this is at some sort of sense level. Now how do you know what you're hearing is not your own thoughts and projections and someone else's thoughts? And
very good point. If you got your ego involved in it, then you got to know it's generally you're creating the thought and you're not doing it. But if you go in there with a real intent to let your higher centers communicate with their higher centers, and you're not interested in what comes out, you don't care what comes out. And when I first started to do this, I was in shock because I would do this and I would find out these things. I was, well, that's not true. That's not true. I've created that. I found out I didn't create it. I would make contact with the person, and sure enough, that's what had happened. In fact, I was able to explain things doctors didn't know. And so it is, and it's the capacity of all people. We do read the minds.
Would you say that in a sense, your skepticism, initial skepticism, was a blessing in disguise because it allowed to counteract any ego intervention, as you were talking about?
That is totally correct. And this is the scientific mind that says, can't be so. Yeah. Can't be so. And so I didn't get involved with the ego. And if I get involved with the ego, I don't ever get involved with the ego anymore. When I go in there, it's what's going on. And sometimes I'm very surprised. Sometimes already knew ahead of time. But I always check it out, you see. Yeah. And somebody says, supposing you're wrong. I says, I'm human. Right. I can be wrong.
So I'm just wondering, so there seems to be something connected to intention. And I mean, the Tibetan Buddhists and Buddhists in general talk about the importance of intention and practice in healing the world and sending out good, loving vibrations and kindness. So in the sense, is it that the intention in its purest state, if a person is totally focused on that intention is in itself the means to establish that connection in the authentic way?
Intention is badly used because everybody has an intention, but we always have intentions.
So we have to be careful about what we mean here.
What we mean by intention. These are subconscious intentions, most of them. We do things and we think we're doing it for this reason, but that's not really the reason we're doing it. And so to say glibly it's intention is incorrect, but on the basic level it is incorrect. It is correct. And that is, intention is a focal level. And we can pinpoint a focus. And if we focus and we say, I want to know what's going on in that mind, that is the only thing I'm interested in. Do you follow? That is intent.
Yeah.
But if I go in and say, well, I'd like to know because I want to heal the person because this means a lot to the world, it means that you got it?
Yeah.
You got your intent all clobbered up.
Yeah.
You just want to know what's going on. You don't know what you're going to do with it.
Now, a little earlier, I'm going to come back to a question. We were talking about emotions and the spectrum of emotions, and we were talking about intellect. Is the intellect, you were implying that the intellect was sort of a particular part of the spectrum, and that perhaps people who are intellectuals tend to get fixated on that one realm of function, and as a result deny themselves this other realm of function. Is intellect, I don't know if you've ever been asked this before, is intellect a manifestation of emotion?
Yes, yes, it is. In fact, everything that we do is a manifestation of emotion. The higher the emotion and the clearer the intent, the better we can handle it by all of the intellectual processes available to us. Now, you're quite correct that intellectual, as we think of it in our society, has to do with processing of information, factual information, into new forms. But when we come into extreme creativity, this is intellectual in a sense, but it is in absolutely different and unique forms that don't follow. So the intellectual process can go into those extremely high levels. I think you understand what I'm saying. Those extremely high creative levels that humans have not explored. These are the originals in the world, and they are the innovators, and they are the visionaries.
When I hear you mention these things, I mean, I come out of a school of psychology which at the time was talking about the bicameral mind, and it was very popular at the time, right and left hemisphere function and linear consciousness. And so intellect in this case, the way you're referring to it, am I correct in assuming that you are talking about intellect as kind of a harnessing of both, that there's a balance between, say, linear function and alinear function or intuitive function?
Correct. And this is where, for example, when I say that the brain does not handle insight, intuition, imagination, and highest levels of creativity. Right. Well, when we extend it into the mind, we have that. Now, there's some exciting new stuff coming in, which has to do with the glial cells. The glial cells are those cells that are in between everything else that we thought were just random, didn't do anything. And now we're finding that in conscious thought, the glial cells are probably much more important than the neural cells.
Is this what used to be called the associational cortex?
No, because associational cortex is primarily a series or a relationship of interrelationship. Glial cells are just spaces. They're just spaces in between everything. Right. And so there's some interesting research going on now in Minnesota and some other places about the dynamics of the glial cells in connection with certain kinds of experiences. But they haven't reached the level that I got into the vibratory fields of the patterning. And they're not using equipment that's sophisticated enough to come close to 1 million cycles per second so they can look at the patterns. But they're working, and the brain people are moving, and I'm happy.
All right, so now, connection of frequency distributions for specific individuals and emotional illness. This was something that you had written in your book, Infinite Mind. Into each experience we take our old patterns. And you also said later on, we have not envisioned psychopathic behavior as a break in the vibrational continuum. When a person's mind field slips over the ridge into chaos, a gross disorganization occurs. Here, we trust only symptoms, not the causes.
Well, that's pretty good, isn't it? Yeah. I like that. Where'd I write that? Let me tell you, I've worked with psychopaths. Yeah. There are two primary things that are going on. We don't have to have the psychopaths in the hospitals that we have, but we have to have some far more skillful technicians and some doctors that don't give drugs. I've worked with these. I've worked with killers. I've worked with psychopaths, real psychopaths, where I had to have a big man to protect me because these guys wanted to kill. Yeah. And I didn't want to die. I wasn't scared, but I wasn't stupid either. So I got me a big man to be in there with it. And what we found is a complete severance of a rational connection. So here are people that come in and they do think they're God, and they're Mahatma Gandhi, and they're Jesus Christ, and there is a complete severance of the fact that the reality says, I may have characteristics like them, but I ain't God, and I ain't Mahatma Gandhi. And so with this severance, part of their thinking is that I am this divine thing. They've reached a divine state of vibrations, but they haven't have any connections into its reality and its functional nature. And so they're stuck up there. Now, I've walked some of these people down the vibrational field and brought them into consciousness, where psychiatrists can now take over. Psychiatry cannot take over when they say, well, I'm Jesus Christ. So what are you doing to me? And so but the vibrations are exceedingly high and there's nothing below it. They're just blocked. And so if we come up, those of us who are capable of going into that schizophrenic state without being schizophrenic, and we just start lowering our vibrations, and we lower them, and we lower them, and we lower them, until they come into a reality and get very scared, pop right back up into the thing, and we work with them. And I have worked with several killers that are no longer killers because they have come down into the rational level, which psychiatry can now work with them. That's one. Number two is anti-coherency and chaos. And when the field is so totally, totally chaotic, then you can't operate on any level. So you don't even have that glorious state of being God, see? And when you get out of that being God, you're frequently a killer because nobody else knows you're God. So you have those two ends that are going, and we have to come through the complete spectrum. So they're both of them. The anti-coherency and the chaos is a slightly different thing. We have to bring them into some level of coherency in the field. This can be done with instruments. It can be done with laying on of hands. It can be done with healers. It can be done with therapists who have that high vibrational field and are very clear and just work with the person until the chaotic vibration is gone. And then you can find out what are some of the extenuating circumstances.
I'm just curious if you've seen this film with Russell Crowe called A Beautiful Mind, because it talks about schizophrenia, and it documents the life of Dr. John Nash, an actual schizophrenic at Stanford University who went on to win a Nobel Prize. But of course it wasn't treated in the manner you were speaking of.
It was not treated in that manner. See, we could have gotten rid of that. And I can tell you that I have brought back probably 7 or 8 psychopaths. It's hard work. It's very hard work. Because you have to work on the high vibrational fields with tremendous amplitude in order to, but it's human. It's human. It's not like some of the German stuff, shock therapy. This is not shock therapy in the brain, because that destroys tissue.
Drug use makes an incoherent field. Could you comment or elaborate on that?
The drug field does several things. I'll talk about it both vibrationally and I'll talk about it chemically. The drugs themselves are exceedingly, exceedingly alkaline. And this is the reason that drugs become addictive. And the field of people who are very anti-coherent comes into high levels of acidity. And they crave to have some stability. And it's not just the hallucinatory part of it, it's the biochemical part of it that brings them into a more alkaline condition. So that when the alkalinity is exceedingly high, incidentally, beside the point, the higher you go in consciousness, the more alkaline you become.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. We know this.
Okay.
And so that some of the problems with some of our psychics who are very high in consciousness is they're sick. They got more things wrong with them, and the temple is not very good. The temple is all mixed up.
Yeah.
And this is because as they go higher and higher and higher, they want more and more starch foods, less and less of the protein foods, which are heavier and more acid, and they exercise less. Right. Even the yogas don't move. They sit and they position. Right. They're not moving, which generates acidity and keeps them in stability. Drug, hard rock, is the same thing. Now, if you've got problems and you reach a field which is totally anti-coherent, you don't know about the problems.
Mm-hmm.
Problem's gone, you don't know about it. If you have some level of coherency, you know you're a mess, and this is bugging you, and you can't solve the problem. So this takes you out of that state into pleasant anti-coherency, acidity, and higher in consciousness.
Now, I want to come into the question of brain memories versus field memories, something that you've commented on in your book as well. You noted that Penfield had noted that under anesthesia, the EEG was inactive, and at the University of California, Davis, Bennett had noted that patients remembered suggestions made under anesthetic to stroke their earlobes upon awakening, and 9 out of 11 did so. So the question is, if the brain, as Penfield has indicated, under EEG, under anesthesia, is not actually active and is not thought to be storing memory, this would imply that field function or field memory is actually taking place.
Field memory is primary. It's primary. It is placed in the brain secondarily. Remember that everything that enters the human body, including sound and touch and light, has to go through the field. So it's already in the field, which is the mind, before it's ever recorded in the brain. And some of those informations don't ever get in the brain. They're sidetracked.
Well, some of these things that you're talking about are moving to the mind field prior to even sensory coding.
Before they ever get into the brain. See, the brain is secondary. The brain has to come through the sensory nerve endings or it doesn't get any information. Right. And the field is out there. Right. It gets the information and it changes seconds to fractions of a second before you get anything in the brain, including loud noises, including touch, including everything. Mind's already taken it up. So what happens, even though you put an anesthesia in and you come down in the brain, so it's inactive, mind's still active. You get all the information. This is why what's happened to surgeons and what they say in surgery is terribly, terribly important to that person. When they make jokes and they do bads. They do bads because this is in the mind field and the person can recover it. Or may not even, Paul, recover it, may operate on it without actual recovery awareness of what's actually happening.
So we're in some respects very sloppy in our Western treatment practices.
We're very sloppy because, see, we're still a biochemical model. And you know why we did this? You know why we're a biochemical model in medicine and in psychology? Back in the 19th century, we didn't have much in physics. We had a lot came through in chemistry, came from the old alchemists. And so the chemical information was more elaborate than was the information on physics. Right. Physics came the last of the last century and the early part of the 20th century. And so we said, therefore, the course in this of life, the course of everything is biochemical. Right. And life, we now know, is not a biochemical soup. It is chemicals dissolved in water that have an electrical charge. And you don't get life unless you got all three of them, you see. And so the primary is the electrical instruction.
So that's the important point, is that our biochemical model is really a relic of the 19th century.
The 19th century, and we still keep sticking to it. This is why alternative medicine has really a difficult place. It's called alternative medicine. It should be primary medicine, and the other should be emergency medicine. Okay, we got to have emergency medicine for when we can't handle it the other ways, but we're looking at the primary cause, which is vibrational. And we take care of this, the biochemistry will come along, or we have to assist it a little bit.
Well, this is we have a revolution to have transpire in this next century, because energetic awareness is, I mean, it's sort of what, it's comparing the Einsteinian model to the Newtonian model.
That's absolutely correct. We have another one that's coming in, and I saw some of your material on religion. We got a major one on religion coming in, because religion is just as antiquated. It's just antiquated. You know, it goes back to the great books of the Kabbalah and the Torah and the Bible, and these are nothing in the world but expressions of human beings and their experience with God. Yeah. So why don't we just go have our own?
Yeah.
This is the primary. See, this is the primary. The other is just secondary. So we live on it intellectually rather than the divine experience.
Well, I have my own thought on this, and then sometimes I think it's that our capacities for higher function, subtle awareness, if you like, takes time, and that we have to reach a critical mass of awareness or knowledge or information.
Individual. Masses of people have to reach a critical place, or the individual.
Both. I think, and just talking for the individual level for the moment, that there's a sort of a critical mass of information that has to be accumulated before chain reaction can take place, and that you get the kind of soul fire, or if we're using electrical analogies, energetically speaking, information is like kindling or a charge that continues to build and build and build, and finally you get a field potential. And when connections are made for various reasons, experiential or otherwise, you get the whole system chain reacting, and you get something igniting.
I have an opinion about that. You can go in from coming down from the higher level into the lower level. You can go from the lower level into the higher level, and both is the accumulation of information, and the truest information is on the higher.
So we have a two-way street here.
We have a two-way street. And the reason we're doing the one-way street is because we're a part of culture. And culture has done this. And it's done it over years, and it's done it as we come into groups to improve our life and to create greater opportunities. That's why we come into groups. We also give up some of the capacity that we have in order to work with the group.
Right.
And when we give up that capacity, then we have to take probably the intellectual, slow, gradual accumulation of certain levels of information to get there.
Right.
But theoretically, if we didn't do that, and we came in on the fact of knowing, as this little child of Valerie knew,
Yeah.
we wouldn't have to go through that. I would learn all the information. When I needed it, I'd get it, but it didn't have to be fed to me. That's utopia. But why don't we think about utopia when we're thinking about the ordinary?
Well, I'm just pondering what you're saying here, but I'm thinking that information, we're coming back to this notion of information being a two-way street.
Well, let me just say something about information. We are entering the information age. The vibratory field is an informational field. Thought is an informational field carried by vibrations. And this is the way in which we adapt and we elaborate the world and ourselves, is through information. Now, that information can be fed to us one way, gradually having an accumulation of these small pieces of information, which has been our cultural pattern. Or we can know that we as a divine being have all of that information available to us. All we have to do is tap into it.
Now this comes into rebirth, and I don't know, you can elaborate on your views of rebirth and Lifehoods in a second, but I wanted to say that if we do subscribe to this idea for the moment of a rebirth, reincarnation, that every previous incarnation has brought with it a certain level of experience and knowingness in that person. And that person comes incarnating in a given culture with a certain level of obscuration and a certain level of awareness. And that perhaps, as you said, when we get into groups, we often have to, if from an energetic point of view, come to the lowest common denominator as the base from which we proceed. Perhaps that's why our culture is somewhat tardy in its views on energetics. Its lowest common denominator isn't quite there yet, so it's quite a lot to accept. So what about this idea of rebirth?
I will change it. You knew I would change it, didn't you? To be rebirthed is a word I don't use, because there's the whole concept of rebirthing, which means you now go through this process of physiological rebirthing. And do you realize that every rebirther has to rebirth and rebirth and rebirth and rebirth because he doesn't get at the information that he should get after? So I call it Lifehoods. I don't call it past life because it's with us. And we bring in, this soul brings in the memory of all of the major experiences this soul has ever had in other lives and brings it in. And it is the dominant thing that directs us, and us in turn, the culture. See, we create the culture.
Right.
Culture doesn't create us. Yes, we're in a culture, but we have created it over time and we perpetuate it. Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about the things that have changed in our culture, for example, sexual mores, and I don't give a moral issue here, I just say they have changed.
Yeah.
They have changed is because the individuals say they don't work. Right. The other ones we had didn't work.
Yeah.
And so they got changed.
Yeah.
I think that probably the most profound emotional information to come into the world today is Lifehoods. And it has been so badly done that it's hokey pokey. There are the Lifehood people that take you back, and they're only interested in whether you were a sheik or a king or a prince or princess. That's secondary. It's what did you live? How did you die? What were the struggles, and how did you get to that place? Because you made a decision in that life to do it this way, right. And obviously it was wrong. And so we have to go through that. Now, I do this I used to do it professionally. I've had 40 years of opening the minds of people. And I only do it now with those people that I think are going to be the masters. And I have them in religion, in medicine, in psychiatry. And these are the people who really are the souls, the ancient souls, who had gone a long ways. And they are recovering this information. Now, some of it is not as important as others. Right. Some of it is not as important as others. But some of it will tell us exactly why the person gets cancer. Will always keep getting cancer. The radio program that was done that had to do with the Kundalini phenomenon, this is grossly misrepresented.
Now let's just, for our listeners, refresh their memories. What is Kundalini?
Kundalini is a concept that came out of India many, many years ago, that there is a latent energy which is coiled down in the tail or the sacrum area, which is there to protect your life when it comes into major, major catastrophe. Now, there's some people that can't raise the Kundalini because they're so inhibited that the thing won't happen. Mm-hmm. There are others that raise the Kundalini and they have no resolution for it. It's just this energy you can't imagine. You can't even believe it. It just blows your mind, it blows your consciousness, it blows your physical body. But if you have the information, you can gradually allow it to flow. And when it flows, you go into states of consciousness that you have never been in before. Mm-hmm. It's like saying, this is the highest drug I ever took. Mm-hmm. The highest drug I ever took.
Is part of the EM spectrum or no?
Yes, it's electromagnetic. I can't give you all of the information about it because it's an energy field that is apparently coiled, and it is with people. And when you feel it coming up, I mean, you feel it coming directly up your spine. And if it gets stuck someplace, it can kill you. Bingo, right there. I had a man not too long ago who was put in a sarcophagus alive, and he raised the Kundalini. How would you like to be in a sarcophagus with your arms at your side raising the Kundalini? I mean, you die with the Kundalini because you can't do anything with it. You cannot move the sarcophagus. And so it depends upon how these things have been activated.
Now is this part of the soul field, the Kundalini? Is it inherent to the soul field when we take human birth, or is it a feature of the human physiology that's there?
I'll tell you what I think. I can only give you what I think because I haven't even gone that far, and I don't know anybody that has either. It's a field phenomenon. It's a field phenomenon. And if this energy is used sexually, it's the most powerful sexual energy that occurs. And this is what many of the ancient yogas said. They had this sexual turmoil that came with, well, they got it stuck in the wrong place, see. Now, if it comes up and it goes up farther, you have the brilliance, the genius that Gopi Krishna speaks about. This creates geniuses, intellectual geniuses. And if you allow it to flow into its ultimate, you have the spiritual greats, the truly spiritual greats, because it's a power source. And the more power you got, if it activates your functions on various levels, that's where you go.
Now, we're not so far from Hollywood. I've observed, like just last night was the Golden Globe Awards, and we have they have the celebration of celebrity. Now, how does celebrity fit into this notion of Kundalini and power? And like for me, when I think of celebrity, I think of it as channels or rivers of energy, and that people are sort of positioning themselves on the riverbanks of this energy field, and then they kind of benefit from that fact. So maybe you have some thoughts.
The great lecturers of the world, the great charismatic people of the world, are the ones that have a very radiant and powerful field, and that's why we follow them. They may be kooky as hell, And they may be some of the religious zealots that we have on television that people just follow, because they want to follow the light and the power. Now, in Hollywood, we have two factors. One is the beauty or the handsomeness, and the other one is the skill with which they manipulate their bodies and their mouths, and the other is the radiant energy. And then we make them celebrities, and we look to them.
So they may or may not have that. Well, the Hindus called it Shakti, you know, the energy. Some of it
They
is.
generally have the energy, but they frequently have major disturbances.
Hence the stories of their scandalous lives.
That is correct. And what happens to them as they grow older, you follow, and their escapades, is because they have the capacity to radiate it, but they don't have the capacities to sustain it and to keep it flowing and to enjoy it and to just live with it.
Now, what role does virtue play in the evolution of consciousness, and where does virtue fit within the schema of energy?
You really ask some questions, don't you, young man? Virtue. We have within our system good and bad. And unfortunately, that's how we look at things. They're good or they're bad. And virtue is a characteristic by which we look at things good. Yes. And we do things good. Now, all things are not bad. It's our interpretation of them. And what is bad to one person is not bad to another. The only criterion I give to what is bad is that which interrupts or dislocates the communal living of human beings. This, I have to declare, is non-virtuous. Non-virtuous. But there are things that are virtuous to some people, not virtuous to others. And so in a culture of living together, we probably have to have a criterion of virtue. Right. And we have to have a criterion of good. But we also have to be much more dynamic in looking at the fact we criticize other people for being bad, and what they do frequently is not as bad as what we do. And so our criterion of what is virtuous and what is ugly is distinctly a learned phenomenon. You buy that?
Well, I believe that it's certainly partially learned.
Oh, you mean what is? Well, I say this: when we reach the highest state of consciousness, the highest state, there is no ugliness and there is no badness. Right. Now, when I work with a person, they got all kinds of defenses, and they may have done this and they may have done that and they may have done the other thing. I don't pay much attention to that. I'll walk around it because I know it's a defense, and I know at the basic and deepest level that soul is pure. It's trying to reach its purity and to manifest it as a human being. So instead of, like psychiatry, try to remove your defenses, I walk around them, and when I get around them and I get the true virtue or the true light of that person, I mean, those other things fall away. Right. They don't need them. But it's real hard once they get up there to know who they really are. We don't generally want to know. We just want to be average.
Safety and mediocrity.
The greatest fear, I think, of the human being is the fear to know his greatness. Safety of mediocrity. The fear to know his greatness and to accept the greatness of others.
Now, in listening to your definition of virtue, I mean, it's quite true that a lot of it is culturally conditioned, and we tend to come with that implication or inference of the meaning. But I was thinking more along the lines perhaps that in your work you've perhaps come to fashion a reworking of words in the same way that we are the authors of culture. Certainly we are the authors of our words and how we choose to define them. So is there a way of defining?
What I do in general is when we have these words which are so acculturalized that they're loaded, I generally don't use those words. Yes. I get me another one. Yeah. Okay? Because they're too acculturalized, you see. Yeah. And so if I use them, then I have to go through this long interpretation of what is my experience, what is my belief system connected with this particular word. Yeah. And so I find it better if I will use another word and say, you may see it as this. I see it as this because it's not hanging all the baggage that came in with the other.
It reminds me of reading an essay from Meister Eckhart from the 13th century once on obedience. And obedience, of course, today is not a very popular concept because we have a particular notion of what it meant. But I went back and looked into the original Latin meaning, and obedere means to listen, and not necessarily to authority in terms of the person above us, but to listen with in very subtle awareness as to what's going on and why it's going on. So when I reread the essay,
When you see, you're talking to the people who already have the opinions of what obedience means. And that's why we have thrown out the classical concept of obedience, because it is not what we want.
now when you say what we want, you mean the institutional structures or the culture?
Or the individual. If we are obedient to everything, we never grow up. We're totally dependent on the culture.
Obviously, in the original meaning, that wasn't the intent. The intent was.
See, if we could ever get back to the original meaning of many of these things, and everybody accepted the original meaning, we wouldn't have any problem. But since they don't, I don't use the words rather than try to change the culture. I prefer to go find me another one.
One of the other things you've observed in your work is that mediums showed explosive concentrations of energy in a narrow, what you called EHF, or extremely high frequency range, and not necessarily the highest frequencies. What does this imply to you?
It implies to me that mediums can predict, can look laterally across the spectrum, and can tell us about some of the past and some of the now, and predict some of the future on a limited level. And that is, they can predict possibly where you're going to go on a physical sense, but they are not visionaries. The visionary one does not take it in this domain. It says, what is the ultimate? And so they have a frequency field which is high but very blocked, and I have tested their field. And they will always come in with the same kinds of things, and you can know where they're going. You can know the visionary is contrasted to the saint, or the mystic. And some of the saints ain't saints. You know this. They are ones who are able to look into the future and look into the past, and that's where most of us want to live. We want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. See. Not what ultimately should happen in the entire spectrum.
You're not a medium.
I'm not a medium. When people ask me to play mediumship, I don't do it. I say,
What would you call yourself?
I'm a visionary.
A visionary.
I'm a visionary.
What do you think of Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphic resonance fields, and how do they connect to what you're doing?
I know Rupert Sheldrake. I know him. He's been here many times. Rupert came in with some real good concepts. And that is, it's called, he calls it morphic resonance. And that is that things from a distance have effects upon things from not a great distance simultaneously. This is a principle in physics. Principle in physics is that things that happen in vibratory fields that occur are everywhere simultaneously. Okay? But it was misused. I think it was a very good concept to come in at the time, but it's misused. The 100 monkeys doesn't exist. You know this. Yeah. And so it became such a gross thing of understanding so many things that we didn't go back to the detail and say, you know, that's true. And what I think here, or what we think in America or in Canada, will influence the world. My little thought is going to do a little bit, but if I get with a group, it's going to do a lot. Now, morphic resonance, for example, can stop hurricanes. We probably could stop earthquakes if we had enough of us to use the thought field, the most powerful in the world. We could stop wars. But we can't get this random bunch of birds that we have in the world to ever get one thought going on the same plane. And this is group healing. Group healing is powerful. It's powerful because instantaneously information can be places. Now, if you have a charismatic healer who is the leader, it's like group prayer. Group prayer, and I will sometime research this, group prayer in the hands of mediocrity is chaos. It don't happen.
There's no coherence.
No coherence whatsoever. And the person said, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed, but nothing happened. Nothing happened. You didn't learn anything because you weren't high enough to learn.
Right.
And so when we get into the sending of information in distances, the more powerful it is and the more coherent it is with numerous people or with one person, the more potent it is when it gets there.
So have you seen an example of group healing? Have you seen, from your own experience, this have an effect?
Yeah, I can do it anytime I want to do it. But I don't use this. You see, I don't use this as an ego thing.
Right.
If someone calls me, and or sometimes I get an email.
Well, I didn't necessarily mean you personally. I just meant like have you seen as, say,
Oh,
just the
yes.
witnessing scientist, how
Oh,
this
yeah.
effect is.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And some of the rituals that are included in shamanism
Yeah.
are not what the shaman thinks, but the ritual is such that you incorporate the energy of great masses of people.
Uh-huh.
Now, you know the thing about in Africa, when somebody has created a crime and they decide that person's going to die, and that person dies. You know this.
No.
You didn't know this?
No, I
Well,
didn't
let
know
me
that.
tell you about this. We have had a struggle with trying to figure out why. I mean, this person, they come into the great chiefs, and the chiefs decided that they have broken so many of the laws of the land that they got to die. So they set the time of death, okay?
Uh-huh.
Now, everybody knows they're going to die. The community all prepares for their death, and everybody gets there, and they chant, and they sing, and they stomp on the ground, everything which would bring life. But this guy is already programmed to die, and he goes immediately into blocking every one of the circulatory systems, and he dies. Now, this is taking it the other end, you see. Yes, we could. If we could decide that we, as a group of people, and I have done it with groups when I had groups in here, we would say, we're going to send energy tonight to somebody, and we're very high, and we have coherency. And I said, I want you to bring the people in. I can give you a couple of major examples. One was one of the persons say, there's this man who lost all the skin off his feet because he had a fire in his house. And he ran barefooted at night to get his children who were in another room. And there was a synthetic rug that was on fire. And you know how hot this is. Oh, yeah. And they burned all the skin off his feet. And he's in the hospital. They haven't been able to make a skin graft work. And I says, let's go after it. So we went after it. And we went there, and we don't say, make the skin graft work. We give him the energy for his body to heal itself. Mm-hmm. And we send it there. See, we don't say, take out your cancer. Mm-hmm. We say, prepare this body with the greatest power. So we did that. We even felt the energy go. I mean, it just zoomed out of this room and went tearing. We have to know where the person is and what the person's name is. That's all we have to know. It went out there tearing around, and we never heard anything more, but we knew it did some good. It was almost 5 years later. I met the man, and when I met him, he said, you're Dr. Hunt? And I said, yeah. He said, oh my God, I want to tell you about my feet. And the next day they did skin graft, and it worked, and they had skin grafted 15 times. Okay. Now here's a case. The energy was so powerful and so clean and so clear and so coherent that he was able to take this energy and to use it so that everything worked. It's absolutely imperative.
Nice story. So you were commenting a little bit earlier about that the spiritual experience was perhaps something that was ingrained in the soul. Care to comment on that?
I'd love to comment on that. In our research in the laboratory, where we were not actually dedicated to trying to find out what was a spiritual experience, we kept getting some individuals who went into very, very high vibrational fields. And we had the recording, and the higher and higher and higher they went, we kept looking at the frequency domain, and we were working at that time upon a subharmonic, because instruments only went to, we were up in the thousands, and there was no reason to have this because in ordinary biology it stops at 250 cycles, and we were up around 3,000 cycles per second, and so we knew it was another domain. In fact, there was a break, actually, between the biological frequencies of the brainwave in the heart and the galvanic skin response in the muscle, which is neurological, of 250 cycles. Nothing happened in the energy field till about 400 to 500 cycles per second. So there was a big break there.
Like a buffer.
Like a buffer, right. It was a big break, so we knew it was not the same thing. And then it went up into the thousands. Well, as we kept recording and recording, we would find these experiences that sometimes it went very, very high. And so we started asking the person, what are they experiencing? And it was inevitable that they experienced something which was light, bright, spiritual, mystical, or had divine figures. And to them, it was a spiritual experience. Now, it wasn't a religious experience. It was a spiritual experience. And we kept finding that once a person reached 250,000 cycles per second, they had a spiritual experience, and that is they now tapered from the ordinary experiences of life into the mystical experience that had the element of beauty, beyondness, and higher level of the soul, which they called spiritual. And we even had some people that when they came back from that state, we asked them what were their religious preferences. They didn't like religion. Some of them said they were atheists. Some said they were agnostics. And some had a rich religious background. But it made no difference. When we reach a certain level, the awareness now is on the spiritual or that part of humanity. And so it's built in. It isn't the thing we have to teach, it's the thing we have to learn to experience.